Welcome to the FinCrime Agent Podcast. To this new episode, we have Yair Samban to talk about the impact of geopolitics and global conflict on AML, sanctions, and compliance program. Yair held leadership roles as an intelligence officer and as a consultant in the financial services industry. His academic background includes published research in the strategic decision and operations of global terrorist network. So we're going to have a lot to talk about with Yair today. Yair, welcome on the show. How are you?
Thank you, Marco. It's great to be here, and I really like your podcast and the FinCrime Agent generally. So it's an honor for me to be featured today. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you. So I'm looking forward to our one-to-one today. I want to jump right into it and wanted to start with the first question to ask you, what are the main actions that you see that governments are taking in response to geopolitical events that are actually impacting financial firms?
Thank you. So across the Western world, we see various governments becoming aware of the fact that we have threats to national security, not only coming from like traditional threats like military and terrorism and so on, but also underlying threats which are of more economic and subversive nature. Very specifically, recently the UK government issued something called their national security strategy, and this paper outlined, it was surprising for me, outlined economic crime as one of the risks that the UK sees to its stability and to the stability of the UK system. So I would say the UK is definitely the last in a series of governments that are becoming more aware of that. What is that threat that they're talking about? What they basically say is that the threat to the UK is coming from actors, terrorist organizations, organized crime, hostile governments that are trying to use fraud, money laundering, and sanctions evasions to undermine the UK economic stability and growth. And this is something that has to be taken into consideration when thinking about either careers or programs in the financial crime space in the financial industry.
Only a quick pause here on the video to let you know that if you're passionate about financial crime prevention and want to advance your career, you must check out my FinCrime Career Accelerator course. It's designed to give you the skills and knowledge to thrive in this exciting field. So find the link in the video description right below, and we are back to the video now. Are there any particular emerging hotspot in terms of where financial institutions should focus when trying to anticipate what is next?
So, unfortunately, there's more than a couple of hotspots, and part of the problem is that financial institutions sometimes, quite frankly, don't know where it's going to hit us. We can point at a few in recent years. I guess, wake-up call in terms of the return of geopolitics to economic crime has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So one major hotspot that has been the weaponization of sanctions against Russia. It was an unprecedented raft of sanctions that has been laid upon Russia. So let's say Russia is one hotspot in terms of interest of sanctions, as well as fraudulent and cyber activity. All these things are interconnected. And when I say Russia, this is not the country Russia itself, but it could be also countries neighboring Russia, countries trading with Russia. Unfortunately, there's a lot of envelopes to this one hotspot called Russia. Another hotspot is the Middle East. What we've seen with the Hamas attacks and with the Iranian war recently is that sanctions are deployed also in this context. There it is more murky, and when I say sanctions, it is moved beyond the traditional sanctions imposed on Russian oligarchs and Russian assets, because all of a sudden you see Israeli politicians being sanctioned, charities that are doing business with the Middle Eastern region are being sanctioned, and so on. So this is a moving target that financial organizations have to keep in touch all the time. The most recent one I will call out is North Korea. DPRK, as it's sometimes called, the Democratic People Republic of Korea. North Korea was exposed recently as employing people that are getting hired in tech companies, mainly in the US, but who knows, maybe they've been hired in other places as well. So this is a covert way to commit fraud even without an official sanctions. I would say the third hotspot after Russia and Middle East would be fraud, whether it's employee fraud or application fraud or like let's say traditional types of fraud, which might be perpetrated by hostile actors and so on. What I want to say here is that the main change, if there's one takeaway from this session, I would like this to be this takeaway. The main change is that in financial crime, we no longer look at individual people or like small scale gangs that are trying to funnel money for some kind of network. We're talking about organized crime, conglomerates of criminals that are using sophisticated methods. Sometimes there's a state like Russia, China, Korea behind it. Sometimes we don't know, but these are organized threats and not just gangs of people trying to move money.
100%. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And uh, where are the banks struggling at the moment, facing emerging geopolitical shift? What help do you think they actually need?
I think the struggle at three levels. The most difficult one to tackle is understanding their role in this new environment. Banks are not law enforcement. So in a sense, what do you want them to do? They can't police the world. That's not their role. So understanding the threat and putting it in the context of banking operations is one of the challenges. Then the next challenge I see is the fact that they're always behind in terms of the sophistication of methods and technology being used. Deepfakes is one example. Cryptocurrencies is another example. I could go on and on with more examples, but there's always a new threat on the horizon that the bank systems have to be hardened against it. And the third, which is like an ongoing challenge, is the fact that they need to modernize their existing systems and prepare themselves for these new threats. And the existing systems are there. Sometimes they're even performing. They're just not performing at the right level they have to be. So to give you one example, they have sanctions screening tools, and those tools find sanctions evasions. But all of a sudden, if the sanctions are being quadrupled because the Western governments impose more sanctions on, let's say, Iran, those tools just spit out many, many more false positive alerts. So the tools are working, but they have to change the way they operate the tools and maybe increase their level of sophistication.
Yes, 100%. I think is required the level of flexibility, especially in domains like sanctions, as you mentioned, that are so quick to change from one day to another. And is you hope that the technology that is in place is allowing the financial institution to adapt as quick as the geopolitical changes taking place.
They actually have tech. What they don't have is the agility to use it in the right way. To give you one example, transaction monitoring in like large organizations exists today. But how do you find the right typologies within that transaction monitoring that will help you find this type of activity? So the challenge is either using your existing tools in the best possible way or replacing them, which entails cost and risk and so on.
I wanted to actually move into a topic for non-traditional actors. For example, the question is on what role non-traditional actors such as crypto platform, shadow banks, maybe state-affiliated companies, what role do they play in navigating geopolitical pressures?
They play a really interesting role, in my opinion, because they are not part of the formally established, banking system and so on. So in many cases, they're not at the table of decision making with regards to things like sanctions and financial crime typologies. On the other hand, they're facing, I think, a very direct threat on behalf of the negative actors, the threat actors. So to give you one example, at some point in its history, Hamas decided to stop using cryptocurrencies. It was after a number of well-publicized seizures of crypto assets by US and Israeli law enforcement. So you could say, well, Hamas doesn't use crypto any longer. It is safe. But then more recently, there was another case of findings from the FBI as to Hamas use of this platform. So what I believe happens behind the scenes is that the decision makers in wherever places these actors are located, they would use the path of least resistance. If they can find a way in through a payments company that their controls are a bit more relaxed, if they can use a crypto currency that does not require a strict KYC, they will do so. And the risk to the platforms that provide those services is that they might not even know that they're being used like that until it's way too late. Because quite frankly, they don't always have the tools to figure out if a certain money transfer is suspicious or not. So the point here is to be constantly vigilant, but also to, as much as you can from a financial institution point of view, be active in monitoring and being involved in industry forums to know what the threats are. You might not be able to catch everything, but at least you're prepared. And if you find like a thread that something is related to you, you can act on it quickly.
Makes sense. Staying informed always help with the prevention aspect. And another element here I wanted to touch on is about correspondent banking. We talked about non-traditional type of business, but also correspondent banking deviates from the standard type of customer activity. So what are the implications for correspondent banking relationships and cross-border payments networks?
So I think this is a huge growth area for banking. First and foremost, we need to acknowledge that, even though there's a risk, and I'll come to that. But the main way to grow quickly for a established financial institution, whether it's a bank or a payments provider, is to create more and more of those partnerships. A good example is for banks to scale and grow and acquire new customers, they might use fintechs as people that bring customers to them, and the fintechs are using the bank behind the scenes. But in every cross-border transaction like that, there are 2 and sometimes 3 or even more banks along the way, because in each stop, a different bank is being used. So the implications are that you need to think not only about KYC, but also KYCC, know your customer's customer, or maybe know your partner, and so on. And this requires, I think, 2 things in my view. One is figure out how to scale your transaction monitoring and KYC to acquire more data and process it more quickly. This goes back to the previous point I mentioned about the fact that you might have the tools, but they need to be increasingly tuned for this new environment. The other thing is a framework of audit or of risk rating that includes those relationships. So in many cases, the bank operates as a bit of an auditor to the correspondent bank. They don't have any formal power of auditing, but they can ask some questions and see what quality of assurance or what quality of measures the correspondent banks are taking. So I think that is an area that has to be bigger in a way. And people can think creatively how to do so, maybe by creating cross-bank partnerships, which is a growing innovation, maybe by creating interbank exchanges, or maybe by working just collaboratively between the people, developing joint discussion forums and so on, so that the relationship is no longer like a formal audit and more akin to a true partnership.
You mentioned earlier the framework that needs to be adapted. Then 100%, I guess we need to get more flexible and updated frameworks if we need to respond faster to these geopolitical changes. So my last question to you is, what skills or actual frameworks should compliance teams be developing in order to stay ahead of these geopolitical threats?
I would say the main skill I would suggest each person in compliance to develop is an awareness and a capacity to learn the geopolitical context of anything they work on. So instead of treating all of this as labels, one day it's Syria, the next day is Belarus, the other day it's Russia, try to understand the bigger trends and where things are going, because that will inform many small scale, medium scale decisions that are being made in your place of work, or maybe where you want to work, and that can make people more useful in the market and ultimately also more efficient in preventing crime. So I mentioned, for example, the North Korean fraudulent activities. That's something I think people should be more informed on, and even check with their fraud colleagues. Have they taken care of that, or are they aware of that? Is something being done? Because this is ongoing all the time. The second thing I would say in terms of the frameworks that you mentioned is to have within compliance departments, not just within threat mitigation and analysis, but within a line of business and within compliance, to have a horizon scanning and a threat awareness point of view. So every couple of months, every couple of weeks, review what are the threats that are coming in the horizon for you, so that you'll be informed what might happen down the line. That's something that, again, I think people are very busy doing the work, but developing a framework to introduce external points of view, whether it's by inviting experts or just having webinars, logging into financial crime agent, going to conferences, but keeping an open window to external input into the day-to-day work of compliance.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we had some very interesting points touched as part of our exchange today. Before we close, if people would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach you?
I am pretty active on LinkedIn, so people are welcome to look me up and reach out to me. And I'm also, I think, a close collaborator of FinCrime Agent. So also through you, it'd be great to get any questions. I'm really happy to engage with people, and if anybody wants to run stuff by me and ask me some questions, I'll be happy to contribute as much as I can.
Perfect. I will leave your LinkedIn profile in the description of this video below. But we are at the end of today's session. I found it very interesting, and I hope the people in the audience will share some comments and let us know what they think about these geopolitical changes that are taking place and how they are actually affected in their day-to-day duties. So thank you, Yair, one more time. And I'm closing as always. If you haven't subscribed yet to my channel and you want to follow more of these interesting interviews, remember to subscribe and press the like button on this video to make sure that this content is spread to more people like you. So thanks all for watching. Thank you one more time, Yair. And until next time, see you soon.